The studio was alive with an electric tension, the kind that buzzed through the air before something explosive happened. The city skyline glittered behind the massive glass windows, but inside the focus was on only one thing: the man sitting in the center of the stage. Grayson Holt, a name that carried weight in the media, leaned back in his chair with the ease of a king surveying his court. For years, he had built his reputation on sharp monologues, devastating takedowns, and the smug confidence of a man who had never lost control of a conversation. His audience adored him. His opponents feared him. And tonight, he had a new target. Across from him sat Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director, a Hollywood icon with a reputation for his no-nonsense attitude, had never been one for empty debates. His career spanned decades, his words carried weight, and yet to Holt, he was just another conservative to dismantle on live television. The panelists flanking Holt exchanged smirks, anticipating the takedown before it even began. Eastwood, for his part, sat in silence, his eyes sharp, his expression unreadable. His hands rested loosely on the desk, his fingers unmoving. There was no fidgeting, no nervous glances, just the calm, deliberate stillness of a man who had seen it all. Holt leaned forward, his fingers tapping against the desk like a drummer counting in the first beat of a performance. "All right, Clint," he began, dragging out his name with the condescending patience of a teacher indulging a slow student. "Let's get real here. You've had one hell of a career. No one's arguing that. But let's be honest, you're old school, out of touch, clinging to ideas that don't belong in today's world. So tell me, are you here to defend outdated policies, or are you just looking for one last political hurrah before retirement?" A chuckle rippled through the panel. One of the younger guests, a journalist from a progressive outlet, smirked as he adjusted his glasses. The audience, prepped and primed to enjoy another Holt takedown, waited for the legendary actor to fumble. But Clint Eastwood didn't blink. He remained as still as a mountain, as if he hadn't even heard the insult. His hands never moved, his breathing steady. He didn't rush to respond, didn't fumble for words. He simply sat there watching. Holt took the silence as an opening to push further. "Come on, Clint," he continued, adjusting his blazer as if settling in. "You made your name playing tough guys. Dirty Harry, the man with no name. But let's be honest, those characters wouldn't survive in today's world. The tough guy act, it's tired. It's outdated. The world's changed, but you're still stuck in a time when men thought grunting was a personality trait." Another round of laughter. Holt smirked, sensing blood in the water. The camera zoomed in on Eastwood. Still no reaction, no smirk, no flash of anger, just that same steady stare. Finally, Eastwood spoke. "Are you finished?" Holt blinked. The laughter died a little faster than expected. He had been sure he had the upper hand. He always had the upper hand. The audience had been on his side. The panel had backed him up. So why did it suddenly feel like something had shifted? "Are you finished?" Eastwood repeated, his voice low, steady. Holt let out a forced chuckle, shaking his head like he was still in control. "Oh, Clint, don't get all dramatic." "No, really," Eastwood cut in, his tone so calm it was unsettling. "Are you finished? I want to make sure you get all your little rehearsed jabs out before I respond." The room tightened. Holt's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second. The panelists shifted. The camera crew, suddenly aware that something real was happening, adjusted their angles. This wasn't going to be a routine takedown. This was going to be something else entirely. A few murmurs rustled through the audience, uncertainty creeping in where there had been nothing but smug anticipation in moments before. Holt, sensing the shift but refusing to acknowledge it, forced another laugh. "All right, Clint," he said, leaning back in his chair, trying to reassert control. "If you've got something to say, by all means, enlighten us." Clint Eastwood finally moved. It wasn't dramatic. There was no grand gesture, no pointed finger or raised voice. He simply shifted, just enough to lean forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk. And then, with the kind of quiet authority that had defined his presence both on and off the screen for decades, he spoke. "You know, Grayson," he said, his voice low but carrying across the room with effortless gravity, "I've been around long enough to know when a man is speaking because he has something to say, and when he's speaking because he likes the sound of his own voice. The words hit the air like a gunshot in a silent canyon. Holt's smile tightened. "Oh, come on, Clint. Let's not." But Eastwood wasn't done. "You sit there," he continued, his gaze never breaking, "with your rehearsed lines, your smug little smirks, and you think you've got people figured out. You think because you've got a microphone and an audience, that makes you the smartest man in the room." He paused, tilting his head slightly. "It doesn't." The room went still. Holt shifted in his chair, but Eastwood didn't let him speak. "You say the world has changed," he went on, "that men like me are outdated, that toughness, resilience, and standing by what you believe in, that those things don't matter anymore. But let me tell you something." He leaned in just a fraction more. "The world hasn't changed nearly as much as you think it has." Holt opened his mouth to respond, but this time, the interruption wasn't Eastwood's doing. It was the audience. A murmur. Not laughter, not applause. Just an undeniable hum of realization. As if they were only now beginning to see something they hadn't before. Eastwood's voice remained steady, unshaken. "You talk about my movies, about Dirty Harry, about The Man with No Name. You say those kinds of men wouldn't survive today. But let me ask you something, Grayson." For the first time, Holt didn't interrupt. "If someone broke into your house tonight," Eastwood said, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather, "if someone came through your door with a gun, with the intention to hurt you or your family, are you telling me you'd call someone like me outdated? Or would you wish to hell a man like me was standing between you and the person coming for you?" Silence, pure, undiluted silence. The smirk on Holt's face had vanished entirely now, replaced by something else. A flicker of something almost vulnerable, almost uncertain. Eastwood let the silence sit, let it stretch, let the weight of his words settle deep. And then he sat back. The movement slow, deliberate. He didn't need to press the point. He didn't need to drive it in. The truth had already landed. One of the panelists, a woman who had been watching the exchange closely, finally spoke. Her voice was softer than before, lacking the bravado she had started with. "So what are you saying, Clint?" Eastwood turned his attention to her, his expression calm. "I'm saying that toughness isn't outdated," he said. "That resilience isn't obsolete. That standing your ground, protecting what matters, holding firm in the face of opposition, those things don't go out of style just because people like Grayson here say they should." A few scattered claps started in the audience. Not wild applause, not cheers, just the slow, deliberate sound of people who had expected one thing and were getting something entirely different. Holt, regaining himself, forced another laugh. All right," he said, holding up his hands. "That was a cute little monologue, Clint. Real theatrical." Eastwood didn't respond. He didn't need to. Holt exhaled, shaking his head like he was still the one in control. "But let's talk facts, because that's what we deal with on this show. Facts. And the fact is, Clint, the numbers don't lie. Your generation is fading. Your values, dying out. The world doesn't want cowboys anymore. It wants progress." Eastwood finally smiled. Not a smirk, not a grin. Just a small, knowing smile. "You think toughness is a generational thing, Grayson?" he asked. Holt hesitated. You think grit, courage, responsibility, that those things just disappear with time?" Eastwood's voice was almost amused now. Holt folded his arms. "I think the world moves forward, and people like you struggle to keep up." Eastwood chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You've got it all wrong, son." Holt bristled at the word. "Oh yeah." Eastwood nodded, leaning back. "The world doesn't move forward because of people like you. It moves forward because of people who know what's worth holding on to." Silence again, but this time it was deeper. Holt's jaw tightened. He could feel it now. Something slipping through his fingers. Something he had taken for granted. Control. Dominance. The upper hand. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. They were listening. The air in the studio had changed. It was thick now, charged with an unspoken energy that neither Holt nor anyone else on the panel had expected. The cameras were still rolling, but the usual rhythm of the show, the rapid back and forth, the witty quips, the rehearsed debates, had been shattered. For the first time in a long time, Grayson Holt was on the defensive. He could feel it. The way the audience had stopped laughing. The way their eyes had shifted from him to Clint Eastwood. The way the quiet authority of the old gunslinger had turned a staged argument into something real. And Holt hated it. He forced a chuckle, leaning back in his chair, trying to regain control. "All right, Clint," he said, clasping his hands together like a teacher indulging a particularly difficult student. "Let's set aside the cowboy talk for a second. I get it. You come from a different time, a time when things were simpler, right? When men were men, women knew their place, and everything was solved with a punch or a pistol." Eastwood didn't even blink. "That what you think?" Holt smiled thinly. "That's what I know." Eastwood let out a slow breath. "You really don't know much, do you, son?" A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Not laughter at a joke, laughter at Holt. His smile twitched, just slightly. "Enlighten me then, since you seem to think you have all the answers." Eastwood studied him for a long moment. Then he turned slightly, addressing not just Holt, but the entire audience. His voice was quiet, but somehow it carried more weight than Holt's had all night. "You ever lost someone, Grayson?" Holt blinked. "Excuse me? You ever had to bury someone you loved?" The studio went dead silent. Holt hesitated for just a second, just long enough for Eastwood to see it. The flicker in his eyes, the momentary lapse of confidence. "I don't see what that has to do with—" "It has everything to do with it," Eastwood cut in, "because that's what life is, kid. It ain't social media trends. It ain't applause from a crowd. It's loss. It's struggle. It's getting knocked down so damn hard you don't think you'll ever stand again." Holt opened his mouth, but Eastwood wasn't finished. "You want to talk about toughness? You think it's just about throwing a punch? Carrying a gun?" He shook his head. "Toughness is watching your best friend get lowered into the ground and still getting up the next morning. It's working a job you hate to put food on the table for people who depend on you. It's holding on when everything in you is screaming to let go." The silence stretched on, heavy as a storm cloud. Eastwood exhaled, shaking his head. "You think men like me are dinosaurs? That what we stand for is dying? But you don't get it, Grayson." He leaned forward just slightly, locking eyes with the younger man. "Toughness doesn't die, it just gets tested." A slow murmur moved through the audience. Not applause, not laughter, just the sound of people absorbing something real. Holt swallowed. He could feel the shift happening beneath him, like standing on a crumbling ledge. And for the first time in his career, he didn't know how to pull himself back. "All right," he said, forcing another smile. "That was a great speech." "Really it was. I'm sure it'll get plenty of views online." Eastwood just watched him. Holt exhaled. "But here's the thing, Clint. You can talk about the old ways all you want. About grit, about resilience, about whatever. But that's not the world we live in anymore. People don't want tough guys. They don't want some cowboy riding in to save the day. They want progress. They want change. And like it or not, you're on the wrong side of history." Eastwood tilted his head slightly as if considering that. Then with an almost imperceptible smile, he asked, "You ever heard of a man named Winston Churchill?" Holt frowned. "What?" "Churchill," Eastwood repeated. "He had a quote, said, 'The farther back you can look, the farther forward you are likely to see.'" Holt didn't respond. Eastwood leaned back. "History ain't just something you bury, kid. It's something you learn from. And if you think men like me are fading away, you might want to look a little farther back. Because the future you're betting on, it belongs to the ones who can stand up when it matters." Silence. Pure, undiluted silence. And then something Holt hadn't expected. Applause. Not wild, not explosive, but steady, building, growing. He turned, watching as people in the audience began clapping. Not because they had been prompted, not because the show's producers had given a cue, but because they felt it. Holt's face darkened. He could feel the control slipping, the moment shifting. And Clint Eastwood? He just sat there quiet, unmoving, letting the weight of his words settle into the bones of everyone in that room. The applause filled the studio, growing louder with each second. It wasn't the kind of applause Grayson Holt was used to, forced, polite, strategically timed to boost ratings. No, this was something else. This was real. and it burned. He felt his jaw tighten, his grip on the armrest of his chair firming as he forced himself to maintain his usual smug demeanor. But inside, something was cracking. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. He was supposed to be the one controlling the conversation, the one making the audience laugh at the outdated ramblings of an old man. Instead, Eastwood had turned the tables with nothing more than honesty. Holt took a slow breath, steadying himself. He had one last shot to turn this around. He leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to sound calculated, measured. "All right, Clint," he said. "You've made your point. Toughness, resilience, standing tall when things get hard." He gestured toward the audience. "People love that kind of talk. It makes them feel good, gives them something to hold on to." Then with a slight smirk, he added, "But let's be honest. You and I both know that nostalgia isn't reality." Eastwood's brow lifted slightly, but he said nothing. Holt continued, "You talk about history, about struggle, about grit, but the truth is, the world has moved on. We don't need gunslingers anymore. We don't need men who solve their problems with fists and bravado. We need progress. We need intelligence. We need courage." Holt stopped. Eastwood's voice was calm, steady. "That's what we need," the old actor continued. "More than ever." Holt let out a short laugh. "And you think you're the one to define courage?" Eastwood's eyes locked onto his. "I don't have to define it, kid. The world already has." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Eastwood leaned forward, placing both hands on the table between them. "You think courage is sitting behind a screen, tearing people down with words? Hiding behind sarcasm and applause from people who'll forget your name the second you're no longer trending?" Holt's smirk wavered, just for a fraction of a second. Eastwood continued, "Real courage is doing what's right even when no one's watching. It's speaking the truth even when your voice shakes. It's standing alone if you have to, because some things are worth standing for." The audience was silent again, hanging on every word. Eastwood studied Holt for a long moment. Then, with a slow breath, he sat back in his chair. "You say the world doesn't need men like me anymore." He gave a small nod. "Maybe you're right." Holt opened his mouth to respond, but Eastwood wasn't done. "Maybe the world doesn't need Clint Eastwood." He paused, then added, "But it damn sure still needs what I stand for." The words hit like a hammer. Holt swallowed. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. For years, he had built his career on tearing people like Eastwood down, on mocking the old ways, on painting men like him as relics of a bygone era. But now, for the first time, he found himself at a loss for words, and the audience saw it. A slow, rising murmur moved through the crowd. Then, thunderous applause, genuine, overwhelming. Eastwood didn't even flinch. He just sat there, quiet and steady, as if he had seen it all before. And maybe he had. Holt forced another smile, but this time it was empty. The control he had fought so hard to maintain had slipped completely through his fingers. The cameras were still rolling. The audience was still watching. But the moment was gone. Clint Eastwood had won. And deep down, Grayson Holt knew it.